My name is Anna Carter. I'm 31 years old. I'm a nurse, and for most of my life, I tried to be a good daughter and a good sister. I thought that if I was quiet enough, helpful enough, and strong enough, my family would eventually see me. But I was wrong. Before I tell you how everything flipped, please like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. The air at my brother's wedding reception was thick with the cloying scent of white roses and expensive champagne. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom, a polished, bright sound that felt entirely foreign. A string quartet played softly in a gilded corner, but their melody was drowned out by the clinking of crystal glasses and the self-congratulatory hum of the crowd. From my seat at a table near the kitchens, I watched my brother, Ethan, at the head table. He and his new wife were glowing under the warm lights, a perfect couple on a perfect stage. He was the sun my family had always orbited, and I was Pluto, a distant, icy afterthought, barely even part of the same system. I was wearing a simple navy dress, an island of quiet color in a sea of sequins and silk, nursing a glass of sparkling water and trying to look like I belonged. Then I saw her moving through the room. My mother, the architect of this perfect day, glided between tables like a queen, accepting compliments with a radiant smile. But I knew that smile. It was a weapon. She reached my table, her eyes zeroing in on me, and pulled up an empty chair. Her hand, cold and heavy with rings, landed on mine. "So, Anna," she leaned in, her voice a saccharine whisper loud enough for the entire table to hear. "When's your turn?" The question landed with a brutal thud, silencing the polite chatter. In that moment, with all eyes on me, I felt the final fragile piece of my composure crack. She wanted me to break, but all I could do was smile back, a silent declaration of a war she didn't even know we were fighting. The feeling of being invisible wasn't a choice. It was a condition of my childhood, like the floral wallpaper in my bedroom or the constant hum of the refrigerator. Our house was not a home for a family. It was a shrine to my older brother, Ethan. He was the sun, the moon, and all the stars, and I was just the dark space in between. My parents weren't cruel people. They were just utterly, completely, and hopelessly captivated by their son, leaving no attention left for anyone else. The most sacred space in the house was the living room mantel. It was a testament to Ethan's golden existence. By the time he was in high school, you couldn't see the wood of the shelf anymore. It was a jungle of gleaming trophies and framed photographs. There was the first-place trophy from a citywide science fair, the MVP award from his junior varsity basketball team, and a series of medals for track that dangled from a custom-built stand my father had made. In the center of it all was a professionally framed photo of Ethan, aged 17, in his football uniform, a look of heroic determination on his face. My father would stand in front of the mantel sometimes, just looking at it, a proud smile on his face, as if admiring a masterpiece he had created. My contributions to the world were kept in a large, brown cardboard box in the bottom of my closet, hidden under a pile of old sweaters. The box was my own private mantle, a collection of achievements that were never quite shiny enough for public display. The first item to go into the box was a blue ribbon from my third-grade art fair. I had painted a field of sunflowers, their faces turned towards a bright yellow sun. I remember the thrill of my name being called, the weight of the ribbon in my small hand. I ran all the way home, my heart a drum against my ribs. "Mom, Dad, look!" I yelled, bursting into the kitchen where they were both reading the newspaper. "I won! First place!" My dad peered over his paper. "That's nice, honey." "Good job." His eyes were already back on the sports section. My mom took the painting and gave it a brief, cursory glance. "Oh, that's so pretty, Anna. What a clever girl you are." She handed it back to me. "Now go put that somewhere safe so it doesn't get wrinkled." "Can we put it on the fridge?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The refrigerator was already covered in Ethan's perfect spelling tests and drawings of stick figure superheroes. "The fridge is a bit full, sweetie," she said, not even looking up. "Just put it in your room. We don't want it getting splattered with spaghetti sauce." I took my painting and my ribbon upstairs. My room was neat and tidy, my walls a pale, empty pink. There was nowhere to display it, so I opened my closet, found an old shoebox, and placed the painting and the ribbon inside. That was the day my collection began. A few years later, a certificate for perfect attendance joined the ribbon. Then came an award for a poem I wrote in middle school about a lonely little star. My box became a repository for all the parts of me that were nice but not important. Holidays were the most difficult. They were grand celebrations of Ethan. At Thanksgiving, my father would insist on a special toast to him before we even carved the turkey. "To Ethan," he'd say, raising his glass of cider, "for making the honor roll again and for leading his team to the playoffs." "We are so proud of you, son." Everyone would clap and cheer. Ethan would duck his head in a practiced show of humility, but I could see he loved it. During dinner, the conversation was a monologue of his accomplishments. My aunts and uncles would ask him about his plans for college, his summer job, his girlfriend. He was the center of every story. I learned to sit quietly and eat my mashed potatoes, offering polite smiles when spoken to. Once my great-aunt Mildred turned to me and asked, "And Anna, what have you been up to? I hear you're quite the little musician." I played the piano, and I had been practicing a difficult classical piece for months. I was proud of how far I had come. Before I could form a response, my mother jumped in. "Oh, Anna is always tinkling on the piano. She's doing very well in school, just a quiet little bookworm." She reached over and patted my hand, a gesture that was meant to seem affectionate but felt deeply dismissive. Then she turned to the rest of the table and announced, "Speaking of accomplishments, did we tell you all that Ethan got an early acceptance letter from the state university?" The brief spotlight on me was extinguished, and the conversation swirled back to its natural center. My relationship with Ethan was complicated. He wasn't mean to me. In fact, he was mostly oblivious. He was so used to being the center of the universe that he didn't seem to notice that I was being systematically ignored. He moved through life with an effortless confidence that came from having his worth affirmed every single day. He'd ruffle my hair as he passed me in the hallway, call me kiddo, and sometimes even ask for my help with his homework, especially English essays. I was a better writer than he was, a fact that was never acknowledged by anyone. I would help him organize his thoughts and correct his grammar, and he would get an A. The praise for that grade would, of course, belong entirely to him. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need the validation. But the lack of it was like a nutrient deficiency. It left me pale and weak. I remember one specific Saturday in the fall of my junior year of high school. It was a huge day. In the morning, I had the final round of a statewide scholarship competition. It was an intense academic quiz bowl, and my team had made it to the finals. That same afternoon, Ethan had a major football game, the last one of the regular season. I had told my parents about my competition weeks in advance. "The finals are on the 24th, I'd said at dinner. "It would be great if you could come." "They allow an audience?" My mom had smiled vaguely. "We'll see, honey. It's a busy time of year." On the morning of the 24th, I came downstairs dressed in my team polo shirt, my stomach churning with nerves. My parents were already in the kitchen, both wearing sweaters in the colors of Ethan's football team. My dad was talking animatedly about game strategy. My mom was packing a cooler with drinks and snacks. "Good luck today, sweetie," she said, as I grabbed a piece of toast. "You're not coming?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. My dad looked at me as if I'd asked a silly question. "Anna, it's the championship qualifier. We can't miss Ethan's game." "You know that, but this is the finals," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "It's important to me." "We know it is," my mom said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. "And we are so proud of you for getting this far. But your brother, he needs our support in the stands. It's different with sports. You understand." I didn't understand, but I nodded anyway. It was easier than arguing. I took the city bus to the competition by myself. My team won. We were handed a large, ridiculous cardboard check and a small trophy. My teammates were hugged by their tearfully proud parents. I stood to the side, clutching my share of the prize money in an envelope, and felt nothing but a hollow ache. I got home just as my parents were returning from the game. They were ecstatic. Ethan's team had won in the final seconds. They didn't even ask me how my day went. They were too busy reliving Ethan's heroic touchdown pass, describing it in breathless detail. I went upstairs, opened the cardboard box in my closet, and placed the winner's certificate inside. It lay on top of the spelling bee medals and the science fair ribbons, another silent testament to a victory no one in my family had witnessed. That night I realized I wasn't just being overshadowed, I was being erased. The transition from childhood to adulthood did nothing to change the fundamental structure of my family. It was a monarchy with a single heir, and my role evolved from the overlooked princess to the tireless, invisible servant of the crown. The expectations only grew, but the recognition remained non-existent. I wasn't just the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the family's emergency fund, their on-call nurse, their emotional shock absorber. My life was the scaffolding that held up the beautiful facade of their perfect family, and like all scaffolding, I was meant to be dismantled and hidden away when the important guests arrived. The pattern of financial dependence started subtly and then became an avalanche. The first major event was when my father was laid off from the factory where he'd worked for 3 decades. He was 58, too young to retire, but in the eyes of the corporate world, too old to be retrained. He was a proud man, and the shame of it ate away at him. He couldn't bring himself to tell Ethan, who was climbing the ladder at a prestigious law firm and had just bought a condo in a trendy part of the city. Admitting his failure to his golden son was unthinkable. So the burden fell on me. I remember the phone call from my mother as if it were yesterday. I was in the break room at the hospital, halfway through a 14-hour shift, my feet aching and my head buzzing from caffeine. "Anna, honey, I don't know what we're going to do," she began, her voice trembling with a carefully calibrated panic. "Your father, he lost his job. We can't make the mortgage payment. The bank called this morning." My heart sank. I was 26, drowning in my own student loan debt and trying desperately to build a small savings account so I could one day move out of my cramped, run-down apartment. "What about Ethan?" I asked, the question tasting like metal in my mouth. "Can't he help? He's doing so well." My mother's response was swift and defensive, as if I had suggested something obscene. "Absolutely not. We cannot put this on Ethan's shoulders. He has so much pressure on him at work, and he and Chloe are talking about getting serious. We can't burden him with our problems. He needs to focus on his future." The implication was clear. My future didn't matter as much. I was the sensible one, the responsible one. I was the one who could handle it. I closed my eyes, picturing my tiny savings account, the number I checked every week with a small flicker of hope. That hope was about to be extinguished. "I'll help," I said, the words feeling like a surrender. "I can pick up more shifts. I can cover half of it." The relief in her voice was immediate and absolute. "Oh, Anna, you are a saint. I knew we could count on you. You've always been our rock." I was their rock, a thing they could stand on to get a better view of their son. I set up the automatic payment. Every month for the next 5 years, $700 vanished from my account and went to theirs. It was a silent tax on my existence. They never ever mentioned it. When my dad finally found a new, lower-paying job a year later, the payments didn't stop. They had simply become a part of their budget, and my income had become a part of their own. During that time, they co-signed a loan for Ethan to buy a brand-new luxury SUV. "He needs a reliable car to impress his clients," my dad had explained proudly. No one seemed to see the cruel irony that my money was funding the mortgage on their house so they had the financial stability to co-sign a loan for their sons. 2 years after the mortgage situation began, my mother fell on a patch of ice and shattered her ankle. It was a bad break that required surgery, pins, and months of grueling physical therapy. Her insurance was decent, but it didn't cover everything. The out-of-pocket costs were astronomical. Once again, the panicked phone call came to me. This time, I was the one who had to manage everything. I coordinated with the doctors. I picked up her prescriptions. I used my nursing knowledge to explain the complex medical jargon to her in simple terms. And, of course, I paid the bills. I took on so many extra shifts at the hospital that my colleagues started to worry. I was pale, exhausted, and running on fumes. I lived in a fog of fatigue, my days and nights blurring into a continuous cycle of work and sleep. I gave up my weekends, my evenings, my entire social life. During her recovery, Ethan was a fleeting presence. He visited her in the hospital once, bringing a massive bouquet of imported orchids that the nurses had to put in the hallway because they were too big for the room. My mother was ecstatic. She took a dozen pictures of the flowers and posted them on social media with the caption, "My sweet boy always knows how to make his mom feel loved. Best son ever." He called her every few days for a quick 5-minute chat. For these minimal efforts, he was lauded as a hero. I, on the other hand, was the one who came to her house after my shifts to change her dressings, help her shower, and cook her meals. I spent hours on the phone with the insurance company, fighting over rejected claims. One evening, I was at her house, gently helping her with her painful physical therapy exercises, when her phone rang. It was Ethan. "Oh, hi, sweetie," she chirped, her face lighting up. I held her leg in a stretched position while she talked. "Yes, I'm doing much better." "Oh, the flowers are still beautiful." "Yes, Anna's here." She listened for a moment, then said, "Okay, honey, you have fun. Talk to you soon." "Love you," she hung up and sighed contentedly. That was Ethan. He's taking Chloe to a new French restaurant downtown. He wanted to make sure I was okay. "That's nice," I said, my voice flat. I was surviving on protein bars and microwave dinners because I didn't have time to cook for myself. But he was a hero for making a phone call before his fancy dinner. The final, bitterest pill to swallow was the issue of their will. My parents decided it was time to get their affairs in order. My dad sat me down one afternoon, a rare and awkward occurrence. He cleared his throat and explained their decision. "Your mother and I have been talking," he said, avoiding my eyes. "When we're gone, we're going to leave the house to Ethan. I stared at him, speechless. He rushed to explain. It just makes sense, Anna. He's a lawyer. He understands property and assets. And someday he'll have a family. He'll need a family home. You've never been that interested in houses and things. You have your career. He was framing it as a practical decision, but I knew what it was. It was the ultimate statement of my value. The house, the single largest asset they owned, the house I had been helping to pay for, was to be a gift to their son. My contribution was erased from history. What about me? I finally whispered. Of course we're leaving you some money, he said quickly. We're splitting our savings 50-50. It's all fair, but it wasn't fair. The house was worth 10 times their savings. It was a continuation of the same old story. Ethan got the mantelpiece. I got the box in the closet. I had spent my entire adult life being their support system, their silent partner, their unacknowledged benefactor, and my reward was to be a footnote in their legacy. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I just nodded, the familiar hollowness spreading through my chest. My worth in this family was not just secondary, it was disposable. The 8 months leading up to Ethan's wedding felt like a slow, methodical erasure. Every decision, every conversation, every celebration was a fresh reminder that I was not a part of the core family unit. I was a peripheral character, an extra in the grand production of my brother's perfect life. My mother, who had never shown much interest in event planning for anything related to me, not my nursing school graduation, not my 30th birthday, threw herself into her role as mother of the groom, with the fervor of a military general planning an invasion. It began with the engagement party. It was a lavish affair held at Chloe's parents' country club. I was, of course, invited, but the invitation felt like a formality. When I arrived, I found myself adrift in a sea of Chloe's sorority sisters and Ethan's law firm colleagues. My parents were holding court, beaming as they retold the story of Ethan's romantic proposal for the 100th time. My mother, resplendent in a new dress, introduced me to a few of her friends with a casual, "This is my daughter, Anna, the nurse." The title was delivered with a strange mix of pride in my profession and pity for my station in life. It was a label, a neat and simple box to put me in so she could move on to the more important topic of her son. I spent most of the night standing near the appetizer table, making small talk with the catering staff. The real planning began shortly after. My mother's phone calls became a daily occurrence, but they were never conversations. They were monologues. She would call me on my way home from the hospital, while I was still in my scrubs and emotionally drained from a day of dealing with life and death, and launch into a breathless report on her latest wedding triumph. "Anna, you will not believe the calligrapher we found for the invitations. She studied in Italy. Every letter is a work of art," she'd exclaim. And the tasting at the caterer's was divine. "We've decided on the filet mignon, of course. Ethan deserves the best." She never once asked for my opinion. She never said, "What do you think of this color scheme?" Or, "Do you have any ideas for the music?" I was a sounding board, a passive recipient of her excitement. I was not a participant. The most painful part was the exclusion from the traditional female rituals. Chloe had 6 bridesmaids, a cheerful, homogenous group of young women who had been her friends since college. They had a group chat where they planned everything: the bridal shower, the bachelorette party, the dress shopping trips. I was not in the group chat. I found out about these events after the fact, through pictures my mother would excitedly show me on her phone. "Look, Anna, here are the girls trying on bridesmaid dresses. Aren't they gorgeous?" We picked a lovely dusty rose color. I would stare at the photo of 7 smiling women, my future sister-in-law among them, all holding glasses of champagne in a boutique bridal shop, and I'd feel a familiar cold pang of loneliness. I had gently broached the subject of being a bridesmaid early on. "Mom, I was wondering if Chloe was planning on asking me to be in the wedding party," I had said, trying to sound casual. My mother had given me a look of deep, patronizing pity. "Oh, sweetie, don't be silly. That's the bride's decision, and she has so many of her own friends. Besides, think of the expense. The dress, the shoes, all the parties. You work so hard for your money. We wouldn't want to burden you with all that. It's really a favor to you not to be included." She had twisted my exclusion into an act of kindness, a protection of my time and resources. It was a masterful piece of manipulation. By her logic, being left out was a gift. The truth was, my presence was an inconvenience to the perfect picture she was painting. I was the wrong shape, the wrong color. I didn't fit. The wedding shower was held a month before the wedding. I bought a thoughtful, expensive gift from their registry, a high-end stand mixer that I knew Chloe wanted. I arrived at the shower, held in a beautifully decorated restaurant, and felt immediately out of place. I knew no one but my mother and a few distant relatives. I sat at a table in the back while the bridesmaids ran the show, organizing silly games and telling stories about Chloe. During the gift opening portion, Chloe opened my gift and gave a polite, "Oh, lovely. Thank you, Anna." It was immediately followed by a cascade of squeals as she opened a set of lingerie from her maid of honor. My practical, thoughtful gift was forgotten in a flurry of lace and silk. As the wedding day drew closer, the final arrangements were being made, and my exclusion became almost comical in its thoroughness. I learned that there was to be a family dance at the reception, where my parents would dance with Ethan and Chloe's parents would dance with her. There was no provision for the groom's sister. I was not part of the choreography. I discovered that the rehearsal dinner was for the wedding party and immediate family only. When I asked my mom if that included me, she seemed flustered. "Well, of course, dear, but it's mostly for people who have a role in the ceremony. You can just meet us for a drink afterward if you want." The message was clear. You are not essential personnel. The invitation that arrived in my mail was the final, formal confirmation. It was a beautiful, thick cardstock monstrosity, announcing the union of Ethan Carter and Chloe Miller. Inside, the smaller response card was addressed to Ms. Anna Carter. No +1, no guest. I was a single, solitary unit, invited to witness the celebration of a family I was supposedly a part of, but from which I felt utterly disconnected. Holding that invitation in my hand, I felt a profound sadness. They weren't just forgetting me. They were actively, deliberately, and systematically carving me out of the picture, leaving a clean, neat, empty space where a sister was supposed to be. The day of the wedding felt like walking onto the set of a movie where I hadn't been given a script. The sun was painfully bright, the sky a perfect, cloudless blue, a backdrop worthy of the storybook romance my mother had spent a fortune to create. I spent the morning in the quiet solitude of my apartment, a stark contrast to the chaotic, joyful energy I knew was humming at my parents' house, where Chloe and her bridesmaids were getting their hair and makeup done. No one had invited me to join them. I was not part of the getting ready photos, the champagne toasts and silk robes, the shared laughter and nervous excitement. My preparation was a solitary ritual. I showered, did my own hair, and zipped up the simple navy dress I'd chosen. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a woman preparing for a performance, not a celebration. My role was to be a silent, smiling spectator, and I needed to look the part. The ceremony took place in a historic church with soaring, vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows that cast jewel-toned light onto the pews. I was seated in the 4th row on the aisle, but I was alone. The rows in front of me were filled with the bridal party's families. I watched as my mother was escorted to her seat in the front row, looking every bit the proud matriarch. I watched my father walk Chloe's mother down the aisle, his smile broad and genuine. When Ethan stood at the altar, waiting for his bride, he looked handsome and confident, the hero of the story. I felt a pang of something that might have once been sisterly affection, but it was buried under layers of hurt and resentment. I was watching a stranger, a man whose life had run on a parallel track to mine, but had never truly intersected. At the reception, the feeling of detachment intensified. The country club ballroom was a fantasy world of white linens, towering floral arrangements, and glittering chandeliers. My table, number 18, was situated in the far corner of the room, a small island of social obligation. My dinner companions were my parents' elderly neighbors, a cousin I hadn't seen since I was a child, and his quiet wife. The conversation was stilted and polite, mostly revolving around the weather and the quality of the bread rolls. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of the head table, where my family was laughing, toasting, and basking in the glow of the celebration. They were a complete picture, a perfect family portrait, and I was on the outside, looking in through a window. The speeches were an exercise in controlled pain. My father delivered a moving, eloquent toast to his son, his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke of Ethan's integrity, his ambition, and the joy he felt seeing him so happy. "Ethan, you have always been our pride and joy," he concluded, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house. The best man's speech was full of hilarious anecdotes from their college days, each one highlighting Ethan's charm and charisma. Through it all, I clapped until my hands were sore, my face fixed in a mask of pleasant approval. It was as if I had never existed. I was the ghost at the feast, unseen and unacknowledged. After dinner, as the band started to play and the dance floor filled up, my mother began to make her rounds. I watched her move through the room, a graceful, smiling predator. She was soaking in the adoration, accepting compliments on her son, her new daughter-in-law, her impeccable taste. I knew with a sinking certainty that she was making her way to me. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. Finally, she arrived, a glass of champagne in her hand, her eyes sparkling with a malicious glee that she disguised as maternal warmth. She pulled up a chair, creating a small, intimate stage at our table of outcasts. The elderly neighbors looked up at her with deference. She was the queen of this castle, and she had deigned to visit the remote provinces. She placed her cold hand on mine, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. After a few pleasantries, she leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper designed to be overheard. And then came the question, the one that had been waiting for me all night, the verbal execution I had been dreading. "So, Anna," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "When's your turn?" The world seemed to stop for a second. The music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses, it all faded into a dull roar. At our table, a sudden heavy silence fell. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor to my left, suddenly became intensely interested in a loose thread on the tablecloth. My cousin's wife took a long, slow sip of water, her eyes fixed on the band. They were all complicit in their silence, witnesses who refused to testify. My mother, emboldened by my lack of response, pressed on. "When are you going to find a nice man and settle down? It's not good to be alone, you know. You're not getting any younger." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, dipped in the poison of 30 years of slights and dismissals. This wasn't a clumsy, thoughtless question. It was a strategic public declaration of my inadequacy. It was a performance piece designed to reinforce her narrative of the perfect son and the disappointing, leftover daughter. I could feel the eyes of the tables nearby on me. I could feel their pity, their judgment, their smug satisfaction. My cheeks burned with a hot, suffocating shame. My first impulse was to wither, to give her the reaction she wanted. I could feel the tears welling up behind my eyes, the angry, defensive words catching in my throat. But as I looked at her, at the triumphant, self-satisfied look on her face, something shifted inside me. The shame was suddenly eclipsed by a wave of pure, cold rage. It was a rage so profound it was almost calming. It clarified everything. In that moment, I understood with absolute certainty that nothing I could ever say or do would change her perception of me. I could not win this game. So I decided to stop playing. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I simply held her gaze and I smiled. It was a serene, empty smile. A smile that gave her nothing. It was a mirror, reflecting her own cruelty back at her. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel her surprise, her frustration. She had expected a victim, and I was refusing to play the part. My silence was an act of rebellion. It was a language she didn't understand. She faltered, her own smile tightening into a grimace. The power dynamic had shifted. She was the one who was now uncomfortable. She patted my hand awkwardly, a gesture that was meant to be dismissive but felt like a retreat. "Well, something to think about," she mumbled, before standing up and quickly walking away. Her regal composure slightly ruffled. I remained seated, my smile slowly fading, leaving my face feeling stiff and strange. The storm inside me was still there, but it was a quiet, contained storm now. The hurt was still there too, a deep, familiar ache. But beneath it all, a new feeling was taking root. It was a feeling of resolve, a feeling of an ending and a beginning. In the midst of my public humiliation, I had found a strange, quiet kind of freedom, the freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose. The smile I gave my mother at that wedding was not just a shield, it was a curtain. Behind it, I was living a life she couldn't see, a life she had never once bothered to ask about. For the past year, while she had been consumed with seating charts and floral arrangements for Ethan, I had been quietly, joyfully, building a world of my own. The centerpiece of that world was a man named Daniel, and the secret that gave my smile its strength, the secret they didn't know, was that I was already married. I met Daniel in the one place I felt truly competent and seen, the hospital. He was a traveling nurse who had taken a 6-month contract in the cardiac care unit, one floor above my station in the ER. Our first meeting was anything but romantic. It was 3 a.m, during a chaotic multi-car pileup on the interstate. The ER was overflowing, a symphony of beeping machines, frantic shouts, and the low moans of people in pain. They had called for extra hands from the quieter floors, and Daniel was one of the nurses who came down. In the middle of the chaos, he was an island of calm. While other people were running and shouting, he moved with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing. He spoke to terrified patients with a gentle authority that soothed them. He anticipated what the doctors needed before they even asked. I noticed him because he noticed things. He saw a frightened child in the corner and found him a teddy bear from a supply closet. He saw a junior resident fumbling with a difficult IV line and subtly guided her hands without embarrassing her. and he saw me, struggling to manage 3 critical patients at once, and simply appeared at my side. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I was so used to doing everything myself, to being the rock, that the question caught me off guard. I just stared at him for a second. I need to get this patient's vitals, but I have to finish charting for the other one. "I'll get the vitals," he said, and just like that, he did. He didn't wait for praise. He didn't make a show of it. He just saw a need and filled it. For the rest of the night, we worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. After the chaos subsided and the sun began to rise, we found ourselves in the break room, both exhausted, sipping burnt coffee from styrofoam cups. "You're good at this," he said, looking at me. His gaze was direct and open, without any of the judgment or expectation I was used to. "So are you," I replied. That was the beginning. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of long shifts and late-night coffee. He was a listener. When I talked, he didn't interrupt or try to solve my problems. He just listened. I started, tentatively at first, to tell him things I had never told anyone. I told him about the box in my closet, filled with my invisible achievements. I told him about the mortgage payments, the endless double shifts for my mother's dental surgery, the casual, cutting remarks that defined every family gathering. I expected him to say what everyone else said, "But they're your family." Instead, he was quiet for a long moment and then he said, "That must have been so lonely." Hearing those words, that simple acknowledgement of my pain, was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. A part of me that had been clenched tight for 30 years began to relax. With Daniel, I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to be the sensible one. I could be tired or angry or sad, and he didn't flinch. He would just sit with me, a quiet, reassuring presence, until the feeling passed. His 6-month contract ended, but he didn't leave. He took a permanent position at the hospital. "I think I found something worth staying for," he told me, and the way he looked at me made my heart ache with a hope I had long since buried. Our life together was simple and quiet. It was built in the small moments. It was him leaving a cup of tea on my nightstand before he left for an early shift. It was me saving him the last slice of pizza after a long day. It was falling asleep on the couch together, watching old movies, his arm a warm, protective weight around my shoulders. He celebrated my successes in a way my family never had. When I was nominated for a Nursing Excellence Award at our hospital, he framed the nomination letter and hung it on our living room wall. It was the first award of my life that hadn't ended up in the cardboard box. The proposal was as quiet and unassuming as he was. It was a Tuesday night. We were both exhausted after a brutal shift. We were eating takeout Thai food out of cartons, sitting on the floor of our small apartment because we hadn't gotten around to buying a dining table yet. I was complaining about an argument I'd had with my mother on the phone. She'd called to tell me about the extravagant deposit they had put down on Ethan's wedding venue. "I just feel like my whole life is a B-plot in their blockbuster movie," I said, poking at my noodles. Daniel put his food down and took my hand. "Then let's start our own movie," he said. I looked at him, confused. "Let's make our own story," he continued, his voice soft but serious. "One where you're the main character. One where your name is the one in the title." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple silver ring. It wasn't a diamond. It was a plain, unadorned band. "Anna Carter, I love you. I see you. All of you. Will you be my family?" Tears streamed down my face. They weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of overwhelming, gut-wrenching relief. He wasn't asking me to join his family. He was asking to be mine. I said yes. We talked about the wedding for weeks. A part of me, the part that had been trained since childhood to seek their approval, thought about trying to plan a real wedding. I imagined telling my mother, imagined the criticism, the comparisons to Ethan, the way she would try to take over and make it her own. I imagined the drama, the expense, the performance of it all. The thought made me feel exhausted before we had even started. "I don't want that," I told Daniel one night. "I don't want a show. I don't want an audience. I just want you." "Then that's what we'll do," he said, without a moment's hesitation. So, 3 months before Ethan and Chloe's fairy tale extravaganza, Daniel and I went to the downtown courthouse on a sunny Thursday morning. I wore a simple cream-colored dress I'd bought for $30. He wore a blue shirt that matched his eyes. We held hands and stood before a justice of the peace, a kind-faced woman who seemed slightly bored. Our witnesses were 2 strangers we pulled in from the hallway, a young couple who were there to file a business license. The ceremony was 5 minutes long. We said the standard vows, but when I looked into Daniel's eyes and promised to love and honor him, the simple words felt more profound than any poem. There were no flowers, no music, no crowd of people. There was just us and the quiet, unshakable certainty of our love. When the justice pronounced us husband and wife, a feeling of profound peace washed over me. This was real. This was ours. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, blinking like we had just emerged from a cave. Daniel hailed a taxi to take us to a small Italian restaurant for lunch. As we sat there, holding hands across a red and white checkered tablecloth, I felt a joy so pure and uncomplicated it was almost startling. For the first time in my life, I had created a significant moment that was entirely my own, free from the shadow of my family's expectations and judgment. This secret, this quiet, simple, beautiful marriage, was the foundation of my new world. It was the reason I could face my mother's cruelty at that wedding, not with tears, but with the calm, steady smile of a woman who knew her worth was no longer up for their review. Our wedding day was the antithesis of everything my mother valued. It was not a performance. It was not a display of status. It was a quiet, deeply personal act of love. And in the days that followed, Daniel and I existed in a small, perfect bubble of newly married bliss. We didn't go on a fancy honeymoon. We couldn't afford the time off work. Instead, we spent a long weekend in our own apartment, turning off our phones, sleeping in late, and talking for hours. We were building the foundations of our own little family, brick by quiet, sturdy brick. About a week after the ceremony, the question of my parents arose. The small, hopeful part of me, the part that had survived 31 years of disappointment, still harbored a fantasy that they might, somehow, be happy for me. We should tell them, I said to Daniel. We were looking at the handful of photos a friend had taken for us on the courthouse steps. They were simple, unposed pictures, but they captured the unadorned joy of the day. Are you sure you're ready? He asked, his voice gentle. He knew better than anyone what a loaded proposition that was. I don't want to hide it, I said, more to convince myself than him. This is the happiest I've ever been. I want to share that. So we chose the best photo. It was one of us smiling, our arms around each other, with the old stone courthouse in the background. It was a picture of two ordinary people who were extraordinarily happy. I had it printed at the local pharmacy. I bought a simple card and sat at our small kitchen table, staring at the blank space inside. What do you write to the people who have never seen you, to announce the most important decision of your life? I tried a dozen drafts. Dear Mom and Dad, I have wonderful news. You're not going to believe this, but I wanted you to be the first to know. They all sounded wrong, too pleading, too expectant. In the end, I settled on the simplest possible statement of fact. On the back of the photograph, I wrote, Daniel and I were married on April 12th. We are so happy. I signed it Love, Anna. I didn't include Daniel's name in the sign-off, a small, cowardly act of self-preservation. Presenting them with a new son-in-law felt like too much, too soon. The act of mailing the card felt monumental. I held it in my hand, standing in front of the blue USPS mailbox on the corner of our street. It felt heavy, like it contained all my lingering hopes and fears. I took a deep breath and slid it through the slot. As it disappeared into the darkness, I felt a strange mix of terror and relief. The secret was out. The ball was in their court, and then we waited. The first few days, I was a nervous wreck. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. I'd snatch it up, my hands trembling, only to see it was a spam email or a text from a friend. I checked the mail every day, looking for a card, a letter, anything. There was nothing. After a week, my anxiety began to curdle into a familiar, sour disappointment. Daniel would come home from work and find me sitting quietly on the couch, staring at my silent phone. Anything, he'd ask softly. I'd just shake my head, the lump in my throat too big to speak around. They're probably just busy, Anna, he'd say, trying to comfort me. Ethan's wedding is getting close. Your mom is probably overwhelmed. But I knew it wasn't that. Busyness had never stopped my mother from doing something she considered important. A week turned into 2. 2 weeks turned into a month. The silence from my parents was no longer a passive absence of communication. It was an active, deliberate statement. It was a decision. They had received the news of my marriage, the most significant event of my adult life, and they had chosen to respond with nothing. The silence was a judgment. It was a dismissal. It was their way of saying that my happiness, my life, my husband, were so irrelevant that they didn't even warrant a 2-minute phone call. The hurt was profound. It was a deep internal bleeding that no one could see. I had spent my entire life feeling invisible to them, but this was a new level of erasure. They hadn't just overlooked my joy, they had actively nullified it. By refusing to acknowledge my marriage, they were trying to render it non-existent. By the time Ethan's wedding day arrived in June, The wound was no longer fresh, but it had scarred over into something hard and permanent. As I sat in that ballroom, listening to the toasts celebrating my brother's perfect life, the silence from my parents was the loudest thing in the room. It was the unspoken context for everything. It was the reason I was seated at table 18. It was the reason no one had asked me to be in the wedding party. My private, unacknowledged marriage had solidified my status as an outsider. When my mother approached my table, her face a mask of saccharine sweetness, and asked that cruel, public question, "When's your turn?" All the pieces clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. She knew I was already married. She had seen the photograph. This wasn't a thoughtless, clumsy inquiry. It was a calculated act of cruelty. She was not just ignoring my marriage, she was publicly repudiating it. By asking me when I was going to settle down in front of an audience, she was making a public declaration that my actual husband, my actual marriage did not count. It was not real. It did not meet her standards. It was, like everything else about me, an inconvenient footnote to be ignored. The realization was like a punch to the gut, knocking all the air out of my lungs. But in its wake came a strange cold calm. The last stubborn vestiges of hope I had been clinging to, the hope that they were just busy, that it was all a misunderstanding, died in that moment. And its death was liberating. I understood then that I had been playing a game that was rigged from the start. I had been trying to win the love and approval of people who were incapable of giving it. My mother had made her choice long ago. She had chosen to live in a world where her son was a king and her daughter was a ghost. She had received my announcement of happiness and had met it with a wall of silence, and so, as I looked into her expectant, cruel eyes, I made a choice of my own. I would meet her silence with mine. I would not argue. I would not cry. I would not defend my life or my husband. I would simply let her have the story she wanted. If she wanted to believe I was a lonely single nurse, then I would let her. If she wanted to erase my marriage, I would let her. But I would no longer beg for a place in her narrative. I would simply, quietly, and completely withdraw from it. My smile was my resignation. It was me finally letting go. The silence I gave her back was not an act of weakness. It was an acceptance of the truth. Our relationship, as I had always wished it would be, was over. And in its place was a quiet, empty space that I was, for the first time, ready to fill with a life of my own making. The decision to walk away wasn't a dramatic, storm-out-of-the-room moment. It was a quiet internal click, like a lock disengaging. After my mother retreated from my table, defeated by my silence, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The noise and celebration of the reception seemed to fade into a distant, unimportant hum. I was no longer a participant, not even a wounded one. I was an anthropologist, observing the strange rituals of a tribe to which I no longer belonged. I stayed for another hour, a ghost in a navy dress. I watched Ethan and Chloe cut into their towering 5-tiered cake, their movements synchronized and practiced. They smeared a tiny, polite bit of frosting on each other's noses for the cameras, and the crowd laughed on cue. I watched my father dance with Chloe, his face beaming with a pride and affection he had never shown me. I watched my mother on the dance floor, surrounded by her friends, the life of the party, her earlier discomfort with me completely forgotten. She was back in her element, the star of her own show. Throughout it all, I remained at my corner table, a fixed point of stillness in a swirling sea of manufactured joy. Mrs. Gable, the neighbor, occasionally tried to engage me in polite conversation about her grandchildren, but my one-word answers and serene, unblinking smile eventually made her turn away. I was emitting a force field of quiet finality, and people instinctively kept their distance. The moment to leave came when the photographer began to assemble the family for the formal portraits. A voice over the microphone announced, "Could we have the Carter and Miller families gather by the grand staircase for photos, please?" I saw my mother's head whip around, her eyes scanning the room, looking for me. This was it. This was the final test. For a moment, our eyes met across the crowded room. I saw the impatience on her face, the flicker of annoyance. It was the look of a director whose supporting actress was out of place. She beckoned to me with a sharp, imperious flick of her wrist. "Come, now. You are required for this scene." In the past, I would have obeyed without question. I would have scurried over, my stomach in knots, and taken my assigned place on the edge of the group, smiling weakly for a photograph that would be a permanent record of my own marginalization. But tonight was different. I simply gave her a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. Then I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I gathered my small clutch purse from the table. I walked not towards the staircase, but towards the exit. My first stop was the head table, where Ethan and Chloe were momentarily sitting alone, catching their breath. They both looked up, surprised to see me. "I'm heading out," I said, my voice even and calm. "It was a beautiful wedding. I wish you both a lifetime of happiness." Chloe, who had been conditioned by 8 months of my family's dynamic to see me as a non-entity, gave me a confused but polite smile. "Oh, thank you for coming, Anna." Ethan looked at me, a flicker of something, maybe genuine brotherly concern, maybe just confusion, in his eyes. "You're leaving already? Mom is about to have a meltdown about the family pictures." "I know," I said, "but it's a long drive back to Denver and I have an early shift tomorrow." It was a lie. My shift wasn't until the afternoon, but it was a plausible excuse, a final polite fiction to pave my way out the door. I leaned in and gave Chloe a light, airy kiss on the cheek. I squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "Congratulations, brother." And with that, I turned and walked away. I could feel my mother's eyes burning into my back. I could feel the pull of 31 years of conditioning, the ingrained instinct to turn around, to apologize, to smooth things over, to do what was expected of me. But for the first time in my life, I ignored it. I kept walking. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and stepped out into the cool, quiet night. The air was fresh and clean after the stuffy, perfume-heavy atmosphere inside. The sound of the music and laughter was instantly muffled, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets. I felt like I had just surfaced after being underwater for a very long time. My car was in the back of the parking lot, a humble sedan among a fleet of luxury cars. As I unlocked the door, I heard my name being called. I turned, and my mother was hurrying towards me, her beautiful dress sweeping across the asphalt, her face a mask of indignation. "Anna, what on earth do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her voice low and furious now that we were away from her audience. "You are embarrassing me. You are embarrassing this family. We are taking a family photograph, and you are walking out." I looked at her, at this woman whose approval I had craved for so long, and I felt nothing but a deep, weary sadness. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. There was just a vast, empty space. "I have to go, Mom," I said simply. "You have to go?" she repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. What could possibly be more important than this? Than your brother's wedding day? My own wedding day, I thought. My husband, my life. But I didn't say it. There was no point. It would be like trying to describe color to someone who was born blind. "You have a wonderful night," I said. I got into my car and closed the door, the sound a solid, final thud. She stood there, momentarily speechless as I started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking space, she was still standing there, a perfect, beautiful statue of righteous anger, illuminated in the glow of my taillights. The drive back to Denver was 3 hours on a dark, empty highway. I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove in silence, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt a soothing mantra. The city lights of my hometown slowly faded in my rearview mirror until they were just a faint, hazy glow, and then they were gone completely. I cried then, not the hot, angry tears of a victim, but the quiet, cleansing tears of a mourner. I was grieving the family I had always wanted but would never have. I was grieving the little girl who painted sunflowers and won spelling bees, who just wanted her parents to be proud of her. I was letting her go. With every mile that passed, I felt lighter. I was driving away from a lifetime of being invisible, of being secondary, of being not enough, and I was driving towards the one person in the world who saw me completely. I finally pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building just after 2 a.m. The building was dark and quiet. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, my feet heavy with exhaustion, but my heart feeling strangely buoyant. I unlocked the door to my apartment, to our apartment, and stepped inside. The living room was dark except for a small lamp that had been left on for me, and on the couch, curled up under a blanket, was Daniel. He had waited up. His eyes fluttered open as I closed the door behind me. "Hey," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "You're home." He sat up and held out his arms. I went to him, sinking into the couch and into his embrace, burying my face in his warm neck. He didn't ask questions. He just held me. I breathed in the familiar, comforting scent of him, the scent of home. "How was it?" He finally whispered into my hair. I pulled back to look at him, at his kind, sleep-creased face, and I gave him a small, real smile. "It's over," I said, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that it finally was. The week after the wedding was quiet. I had expected an explosion, a barrage of angry phone calls, a hailstorm of guilt-laden text messages from my mother, but there was only a profound, ringing silence. It was the same silence that had followed my wedding announcement, but this time, it felt different. It was no longer a punishment I was enduring. It was a boundary I had created. For the first time, the silence was on my terms, and it was peaceful. During that week, I finally told Daniel everything. Not just the broad strokes of my family's dysfunction, but the small, painful details I had always kept hidden away. I told him about the cardboard box of my childhood achievements, about my mother's public humiliation of me at the wedding, about the cold finality in her eyes as I drove away. I laid all the broken pieces of my past out on the table between us, and he didn't try to fix them. He just listened, his hand holding mine, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of my memory. When I was finished, my voice hoarse from talking, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You carried that all by yourself for a very long time. You don't have to anymore." It was his idea to have a party. A party? I asked. The idea of any kind of celebration felt foreign and exhausting. Not a party, he corrected himself. A gathering. They had their big, perfect celebration. Now we should have ours. A real one. I was hesitant. I didn't want a second wedding reception. I didn't want gifts. I didn't want to be the center of attention. It's not about that, Daniel insisted gently. It's about celebrating our life, our marriage with the people who actually see us. The people who show up. It's about building our own family. The phrase struck a chord deep inside me. Building our own family. It was exactly what we were doing, what I had been yearning for my entire life. So I agreed. The planning process was the polar opposite of the military campaign my mother had orchestrated for Ethan's wedding. There were no binders, no calligraphers, no caterer tastings. One Saturday afternoon, we sat on our couch and composed a group text message. We sent it to about 20 people. A few of my closest friends from the hospital, a couple of Daniel's old friends who lived in the city, our friendly neighbors from down the hall, and my favorite cousin, Sarah, the only member of my extended family who had ever made me feel truly seen. The text was simple. "Hey everyone, we got married a while back and wanted to celebrate with the people we love. No gifts, no fuss, just pizza, beer, and bad music at our place next Saturday. Hope you can make it." The responses started flooding in almost immediately, a cascade of joyful, enthusiastic emojis and exclamation points. There was no obligation, no formality, just genuine happiness for us. The night of the party, our small apartment buzzed with a warmth and energy it had never held before. We had pushed our secondhand couch against the wall, bought a few cases of craft beer, and ordered a mountain of pizza from the local place down the street. Daniel made a playlist of our favorite cheesy 80s rock and 90s pop, and the sound of it filled the room. Our friends started to arrive, not with formal store-bought cards, but with 6-packs of beer, bottles of cheap wine, and homemade desserts. My friend Maria, a fellow ER nurse, brought a ridiculously large pan of her famous 7-layer dip. Our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a retired history teacher, brought a bottle of sparkling apple cider because he knew I didn't drink. Every small gesture was so full of thought and genuine affection that it almost brought me to tears. The apartment was crowded and loud. People sat on the floor, on the arms of the couch, and leaned against the kitchen counters. The conversations were real and boisterous, punctuated by loud bursts of laughter. No one was trying to impress anyone. No one was performing. They were just being together. I stood in the corner of the room for a moment, just watching. I saw Daniel laughing with my cousin Sarah, telling her the story of how we met in the ER. I saw Maria animatedly recounting a ridiculous story from our last shift to a rapt audience. I saw Mr. Henderson engaged in a deep conversation with one of Daniel's friends about the Civil War. It was a beautiful, chaotic, mismatched collection of people, and they were all here for us. They were our people, our tribe. Later in the evening, when everyone was full of pizza and feeling happy, Daniel clinked a beer bottle with a spoon to get everyone's attention. The room quieted down. He stood in the middle of the living room, his arm around my waist, and his face was glowing with a happiness so pure it was contagious. "I don't want to make a big speech," he started, his voice a little shaky with emotion. "I just want to thank all of you for being here. When I moved to Denver, I didn't know anyone, and now I have this." He gestured around the crowded room. "I have all of you, and most importantly, I have her." He turned to me and his eyes were shining. "To Anna," he said, his voice dropping so that it felt like he was speaking only to me, "for being the strongest, kindest, most incredible person I have ever met. And to all of us, for proving that family isn't about the people you're born to. It's about the people who show up." He raised his bottle. "To our family, to your family." Everyone in the room cheered, and the sound washed over me like a warm wave. This time the tears came and I didn't try to stop them. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of a joy so profound it felt like it was remaking me from the inside out. This was family. It wasn't about blood or duty or obligation. It was about choosing and being chosen. It was about listening. It was about celebrating the small wins and showing up for the hard times. It was about bringing 7-layer dip to a party just because you know your friend loves it. As the night wound down and our friends started to leave, hugging us goodbye at the door, a deep sense of peace settled in my soul. After the last guest had gone, Daniel and I stood in the middle of our messy living room, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and paper plates. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder. "Happy?" he whispered. I leaned back against him and surveyed the happy wreckage of our party. I thought about the cavernous, perfect ballroom of my brother's wedding, with its polite applause and its cold, lonely corners. And then I looked at our own small, imperfect, love-filled space. "More than happy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm home." I had spent my entire life trying to earn a place at a table where I was never truly welcome. I had starved myself of affection, hoping for a few crumbs of approval. That night, I finally understood. I didn't need a seat at their table anymore. I had built my own, and it was filled with love. Months passed. The silence from my family remained unbroken, and with each passing day, its power over me diminished. It was no longer a painful void, but a peaceful quiet. A space I filled with my own life. Daniel and I settled into the comfortable rhythm of our marriage. We worked hard at the hospital, came home exhausted, and found solace in each other's presence. We adopted a clumsy 3-legged dog from a local shelter and named him Hopper. We painted our living room a cheerful shade of yellow. We were building a life, a real and tangible thing, full of small joys that felt more significant than any grand gesture my family could have ever offered. Then, one Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an unsaved number. My heart gave a familiar, nervous flutter before I reminded myself that I was safe now. I opened the message. It was from my mother. "I hope you're happy, Anna," the text began, the words dripping with a cold, bitter sarcasm. "You truly embarrassed us at the wedding. Walking out like that. All of our friends were asking where you went. You have no idea how it looked. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By humiliating your family on your brother's most important day? You have a selfish streak I truly don't understand." I read the message once, then I read it again. A year ago, these words would have shattered me. They would have sent me into a spiral of guilt and self-doubt. I would have cried. I would have drafted a dozen apologetic, pleading replies, trying to explain, trying to make her understand. But as I stood in my sun-drenched kitchen, with Hopper asleep at my feet, I felt nothing. The words were just black marks on a white screen. They were powerless. They were the desperate, angry buzzing of a fly trapped behind a pane of glass. She wasn't angry because I had embarrassed her. She was angry because I had taken away her power over me. My quiet exit had been a declaration of independence, and she couldn't stand it. I thought about her question at the wedding. "When's your turn?" I looked around my small, happy home. I thought of Daniel's laugh, of the comfortable weight of Hopper's head on my lap, of the friends who filled our apartment with laughter. My turn had already come and gone. In a quiet courthouse on a sunny Thursday. My turn was now. My turn was every day. I didn't need to reply to her text. My silence had been my answer at the wedding, and my silence would be my answer now. My happiness was my answer. My peace was my answer. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about telling them that what they did was okay. It was about recognizing that what they did no longer had the power to hurt me. I was forgiving the hold they once had on me. I was letting it go. I deleted the message. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. It was the same smile I had given her at the wedding. Not a smile of weakness or of pain, but a smile of quiet, unshakable strength. The smile of a woman who had finally found her own family. They wanted me to play small. Instead, I chose peace. If you've ever had to smile through pain and reclaim your worth in silence, subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.